So we're continuing our series on doubt, even though it's St. Patrick's Day, right? The broest day of the year, as I heard someone call it. I was kind of bummed last night. I was like, oh man, I'm not going out on St. Patrick's Day. And then I was like, oh man, all those years working in a bar, I'm not going out on the night before St. Patrick's Day, right? Where everybody's like, gets drunker and drunker and then just tells you how much more Irish they are than everyone there, and even though their last name's like, I don't know, Smith or Fritz. Yeah. Gonzalez might work. I mean, Spanish Armada happened, so there's a lot of Spanish last names, especially around Dublin. But anyway, yeah, history nerd. I'm currently listening to a 700-part podcast on the history of England. Yeah, that's how nerdy your pastor is. But we're continuing our series on doubt, and we wanted to spend time in doubt and talking about our doubts and talking about how the Bible talks about our doubts. Just because this time of Lent, right? We were trying to reimagine what Jesus is going through in the desert. And Jesus is going out into the desert by himself. The Spirit drives Jesus out there, and Jesus is like, man, like, it's just me and, like, Satan, right? Doubt. Coming up to Jesus, right? So I wanted to kind of think about what sort of doubts do we have. And so this morning we're going to be talking about, what if I'm all alone in this? How many people have ever had that sort of doubt? Like, what if it's just me? You ever feel that way? Like, what if it's just me as like a person, or what if it's just me, like, what if there is no God? Right? That's a pretty lonely feeling. And this really hits home for me, because one of the doubts I struggle with the most is the feeling of loneliness, right? How many of you grew up in big families, right? Like lots of people around all the time. I did. And so when I first got married, Jess and I both worked different schedules. I was still working at Food Lion as a butcher, and she had found an office job, right? So she worked Monday through Friday, and I worked whenever they scheduled me, right? Anybody had that sort of hourly work where they're like, we're not going to give you a set schedule because that would make your life easier. But I worked constantly and at random schedules with no set days off. And at that time, every time I took a test, I tested it as an extreme extrovert. Any extreme extroverts out there? Yeah. When you're by yourself, it's not good, right? Like, introverts, like, you're by yourself, you'll have finished 3 books, you'll have organized the shelves, you'll have put everything away, people walk in the door, you start frowning, right? But extreme extroverts, it's not good. It felt like it was going to kill me. I didn't even have time, at the time, I didn't even have the cats for most of the day, right? Now I have my cats, so I can pretend like I'm not as much of an extrovert, and I'll just like sing songs and talk to my cats, right? But they were indoor-outdoor cats at the time, so during the day they'd be like, see you later. I'd be like, come on, guys. They'll be like, we'll be back for food later. I didn't know what to do once I was alone with my thoughts, right? I processed my emotions out loud, and there was no one to listen to them. My whole family processes their emotions out loud. Like, that was a really big adjustment for Jessica when she became a part of our family. Coming from Montana, where it's cold and people don't talk to each other, right? To this Southern Irish family that just anything in your head comes out and everybody processes it together at whatever volume you decided for it to be, which in my family was usually at an 11, right? So I had no one to process my emotions with, and social media didn't help, because most of my friends or friend group at the time was either at work or they were still asleep from the work of the night before, and it never really helps with loneliness, does it, social media, right? Like, Facebook can say all at once it was invented to, like, connect people, but it doesn't. It's informative. It helps you, like, know when things are happening, so that's good. But Facebook was really created so that college students at Harvard could rate each other's attractiveness, right? So I think some of that toxicness is still sticking around there. It certainly didn't help Zuck out, did it? Other than with the money. But it somehow seems that like Facebook always seems to make stuff a little bit worse, or Instagram. Like Instagram, I can't do a lot of Instagram, y'all, because people on Instagram, they're just like, everything's way too happy. Like, I don't think Instagram allows you to post a sad picture, right? Unless it's like a contemplative sad picture, like, the flowers are dying, right? Like, so all of this stuff, like, it wasn't helping me. Like, it wasn't allowing me to get that interaction I wanted. I was super lonely. And Jess would call me, like, this is like our first couple months married. She would call me on her lunch break, and eventually she just had to stop calling me. Like, she was calling because she wanted to talk to me so much because she loved me or something. And, like, when she would call me, I sounded like a Morrissey album on repeat, right? Like, it was just like, the world is ending, everything's terrible, nothing's cool anymore. Like, just put on my guy liner, lay at the mall, right? And just like, it was so bad. And I thought I was never gonna feel better. And I thought that this loneliness was gonna last forever. And that's what loneliness would do to me, because I grew up with people always being around. I never lived without family or multiple roommates. But when you're used to that, when you're used to the noise in your life, when you're used to the noise of even just other people's presence, when that goes away, this little voice creeps into your brain. It crept into my brain that would tell me, you're all alone. Oops. Sorry about that. It would tell me you're all alone, right? You ever hear that voice? I mean, for the most part, I was only like alone for an 8-hour period out of Monday through Friday, like 8 hours a day, Monday through Friday. That's not that bad. That's not a long time to be alone, right? Especially not by like American standards. But to me, that was an eternity. I was like one of those toddlers that sits next to the bathroom and cries because mom closed the door and starts yelling like that they're lonely, right? That was the amount of time I was by myself, but I was that lonely in that time. And we all struggle with the feeling of loneliness. And recent data says that we're beginning to feel lonely more and more and more, right? This is the most connected the world's ever been. This is the easiest time in our lives to contact other people, right? You don't even have to remember phone numbers anymore, right? You don't even have to remember how to spell somebody's name. You just tell the phone, right? Like my niece can't really read or write, but she can talk into the phone, and Suri gets her whatever she wants, regardless of what my parents' credit card says she should be getting, right? But we're social creatures. We've been created to be social creatures. And we're beginning to feel more and more lonely, even though there's more and more people on this planet, even though there's more and more ways to talk, to interact with those people. But as social creatures, everything in our biology is designed to seek out other people in very real ways. And that's the thing, right? So we're created to be social creatures. We do all these things that we create trust with people, we create bonds with people. That's why you like having a friend group, hopefully, that you like having people around you. That's why we want to be around other people. And you came here this morning, so it seems like you want to be around other people. Maybe you don't, right? But we've been created as creatures that need to be around other people. But in this country, and maybe other parts of the Western world, but mostly in this country, right? We've been sold this lie, this philosophy that tells us we should seek to be the most unique individuals possible. We should become self-reliant, as self-reliant as possible. Rugged individualism in this country was created as a response to European immigrants whose journey to the Americas was predicated by some sort of communal tragedy, right? People didn't come here from Europe because things were going great, right? Those people went back to Europe, right? Like, if things were going great, they didn't stay here. So our ancestors, like if you look kind of like me, our ancestors came here because something happened, Something happened in their community that caused them to separate from their community. And in that pain and in that struggle, that post-traumatic stress, right? This idea that you have to be self-reliant and self-sufficient became something. I think sometimes that's what, and I didn't want to go into all this. I think sometimes that's why we struggle with racism so much in America. And we've seen in this past week that this is a global epidemic. White supremacy is a global epidemic. But I think that's sometimes why we struggle with it so much, because we've created this myth around ourselves that being self-reliant, self-sufficient is who we are. That's our culture, right? But nothing could be further from the truth. We're all supposed to be in a community. And as the top, I hate to even call whiteness a culture, but as the top tier, we just think that's normal, and we don't have to band together. We don't struggle with as many things. I know we all have struggles. We get it, right? But we get into this moment of like, this is who we are. There's no community. There's no idea of ourselves as a community. And the centuries of holding the standard of individualism is literally killing more and more people each year, right? As a people group, as Americans, this is the wider group of Americans, right? Suicides have increased in the past decade, right? Yeah, it's the number one killer of soldiers, right? Not other people firing weapons at them, not bombs or anything else. It's suicide. Because it's intense, disconnected feeling of loneliness that comes from reintegrating into a society that doesn't want to be communal, right? And there's so much of that happens all over the place. Men in their 40s are at a higher risk of suicide than any other group in this country because they don't have community. What happens in your 40s? Divorce, right? A lot of times. Career loss. It's really hard to change careers, right? Midway. And so there's this disconnectedness. There's this inability for adult males to have friendships, right? Isn't the joke always like Jesus was in his mid-30s and had 12 friends, right? That was the real miracle, right? But it's hard. It's hard to connect. And this is one of those places you can connect. But this focus on individualism, this focus on self-reliance, and this focus on deteriorating the community or shrinking the community, right? For when I was a kid, the community was your immediate family, like your mom or dad's nuclear family. That was your family, right? Or in our case, sometimes it was so many cousins I don't even want to count, right? But it's shrinking because we move and we go different places and we don't have any places to connect, to where it just becomes everybody inside of your house, right? That becomes your community. That becomes your communalness. And there's so many bad things that are happening from this. And it's Lent, so I can make you feel a little bad, right? But think about the opioid epidemic, right? Where's that hitting the hardest? You would think it would be in the cities, right? In urban communities. But the opioid epidemic is not hitting hardest in urban communities. It's hitting the hardest in rural communities, right? And that's crazy in a lot of ways. Because in rural communities, there's less hope, there's less connectedness. If you grew up in a rural community, what did your friends do when they graduated high school or graduated college? They left, right? So you lost that community. Where did the jobs go? They left too, right? So you have this more and more building of these places where we used to socialize and gain greater access to each other, becoming places where there's all this psychological and social and spiritual pain, right? Because of loneliness. And in so many ways, that loneliness is growing for so many different reasons. Y'all, you know this is the first generation, like my generation is the first generation in almost a century that is on schedule to earn less money and have less prosperity than their parents did. That's nuts. Like in America, that's nuts, right? Because there's enough wealth, especially in this country. Good Lord, we have most of the world's wealth, right? There's enough wealth in this country for that not to be the case. So all of us are struggling with doubt, right? With the doubt of whether there is anyone in the struggle with us. If there's anything going on with us. Because we have this biological desire, right? A real biological desire. Like the scientists now can look at your brain and your genes and tell you this is where it's at. But biologically, we have a deep desire for community. Each of us biologically has a desire for engagement. We don't want to just be in community. We want to be engaged by that community, right? Even if you're a wallflower, you want somebody to try and push your wallflower buttons, right? That's why you enjoyed youth group in middle school so much. Because that weird guy would just be like, hey, what's going on, buddy? Come on in, right? Gotta keep you awake. Each of us has a biological desire for dependence on other people, right? We celebrate independence, and that's good, right? It's good to not have to just rely on everybody else. But we are biologically designed to depend on each other. That's why when you feel lonely, that's why that feeling's there. Those chemicals that are happening in your brain, they're there for a reason. It's saying hey, get back with the tribe, dude. Go back to the bonfire. Don't just sit out here in the woods on your own. I don't know. I'm trying to imagine early people, right? What did they do? Cool, you painted your hand on the wall. Now go see everybody else, right? But we've been taught to control our interactions with other people, right? We've been taught to seek that independence and control our actions with other people. We've been taught to not be vulnerable around other people, right? Because dependence and engagement require vulnerability. Vulnerability is rough. Who likes being vulnerable? Raise your hand. Right? It's just Sam. All right. Nobody likes vulnerability. It's a scary thing for us. But it's not for some cultures, right? You ever meet somebody that they've come from somewhere else and they just tell you everything that's going on in their life? Because they're used to communal living? I love that. It's my favorite. That was some of my favorite times at the hospital, right? I would go in and there'd be an immigrant family and they would just tell me everything that was going on with the patient. And then they would tell me everything that was going on with all these people that I had no idea who they were. And it just wouldn't stop, right? It was the best. It was just everything was wide open. But we've been taught to control that, not to be vulnerable, to be masters of our own destiny. Here's a quote from, this is from the 70s, but it's psychologist Philip Slater. Individualism is rooted in the attempt to deny the reality of human interdependence. One of the major goals of technology in America is to free us from the necessity of relating to, submitting to, depending on, or controlling other people. Unfortunately, the more we have succeeded in doing this, the more we have felt disconnected, bored, lonely, unprotected, unnecessary, and unsafe. The more we have felt disconnected, bored, lonely, unprotected, unnecessary, and unsafe, right? I walk around with the cumulative knowledge of humanity in a device in my pocket, and I feel more bored, disconnected, lonely, unprotected, unnecessary, and unsafe. That seems like it shouldn't be that way, right? It seems like it should be the opposite. So when we sit in this loneliness, right, when we sit in this doubt of loneliness, it can be rough. And there was a guy in the Bible who I've kind of poked fun at before, but a pretty serious dude. His name was the prophet Elijah, right? And he'd been a part of a movement to try and bring his people back to God. Because he and the other prophets had stood up against this king named Ahab and this queen named Jezebel. And Jezebel gets a bad rap, and we can talk about that at some other time too. Because Jezebel is a Canaanite just doing her Canaanite thing, right? She's just practicing her own religion, and she has a husband who's like, well, I want to do that too, and then tries to force all of his people to. And then, of course, because of patriarchy and stuff, we just blame her. But anyway, So Elijah had taken up this challenge, right, with there's these 80 prophets of Baal, and there was just the one prophet Elijah, and they both had a bonfire that they needed to get their God to start, right? So Baal was this storm god, and then there was Yahweh, the Israelite God, and one of them needed to start a bonfire to prove which one was the best one. And Elijah, you know that story, right? Most of us know that story. Elijah prays, the prophets of Baal cut themselves and hoot and holler and do all this stuff to try and get Baal to light the bonfire. Nothing happens. Elijah simply prays, and whoosh, like fire falls from the heavens, and it takes up the bonfire and all that, and then he chops off the heads of all the prophets of Baal. The Bible is super metal, right? But they stood up to Jezebel and Ahab, Elijah and these prophets. And Elijah had been faithful and stood strong, and he just witnessed God do this amazing thing. But this had led the king and queen to seek his death even harder. So what does Elijah do? He runs. And he runs to a specific place, right? He runs to the holy mountain. He runs to Mount Horeb, where this is where Moses gets the 10 commandments, right? The 15 commandments, right? Just kidding, right? Monty Python? Anybody? Not Monty Python, History of the World, right? Anyway, Mel Brooks. But he runs to this holy mountain, and he feels alone and terrified. And he saw the power of God. But the reality of his disconnection to his human community, this had allowed the doubt of loneliness to creep in, right? Because sometimes you can be really close to God, right? You can see God doing amazing things, and then all of a sudden, other stuff starts happening in your life, and you become disconnected with the people around you, right? And when you become disconnected to the people around you, it doesn't matter how close you felt to God in that moment. That doubt of loneliness and that fear that maybe all that was made up, that creeps back in, right? That's why spirituality is a good thing, but we're communal people, so our spirituality is also communal. We can't do all of this in a vacuum, right? So 1 Kings 19:10. Elijah's run to this mountain, right? He's run to this mountain, and he's hiding out in a cave. Who knows? Maybe this is the cave that Moses was at, right? And all the 10 commandments happened. But there's probably a lot of caves, so we don't know which cave it was. But Elijah replied, "I've been very passionate for the Lord God of the heavenly forces, because the Israelites have abandoned your covenant. They have torn down your altars, and they have murdered your prophets with the sword. I'm the only one left, and now they want to take my life too." So, speaking of isolation, right, and feeling disconnected, if you wanted a church that makes you feel disconnected from other Christians, welcome, right? Because when you stand up for justice, and when you say things like patriarchy and fighting white supremacy, and you do events where people beat guns into garden tools, not everybody wants to be your friend, right? But do you ever feel this way? Because Mission Gathering, our radical message of inclusion and our stand for justice is an isolating stance, right? It can be very isolating. And it can leave you feeling alone. Your parents, your family, some of you, your children, some of your old friends may all seem like they're seeking your destruction, right? Like you get on there to say, had a great time at church. Pastor Andrew rambled for a little while, but then he got to this really cool point, right? And then all of a sudden, your Facebook's blowing up, right? All of a sudden, you're getting a text message from somebody you haven't spoken to in 10 years. It may not be going, after your life, although, let's be real with this, right? Many of them are unwittingly seeking the lives of LGBTQ teens with their messages of white cis hetero supremacy. Again, an isolating message we have here. I understand that. It's inclusive, but that doesn't mean everyone's going to like it, right? If your church, you're going to have friends who the church says, "You're good." Did you guys read that? Sorry. Did you guys read did y'all read the, because that's inclusive. Did y'all read the thing about one of the mega churches? I can't remember the mega church. But the young girl that was going there and wasn't allowed to lead worship in youth group because she's a lesbian? Whole life going to this church, family loved it. They're like, everybody's welcome. And right before she gets up to lead this like worship thing, they're like, no. Sorry, your lifestyle. Right? Your lifestyle is keeping you from being able to do this. Do you know that when that happens to a teenager, an LGBTQ teenager, they are so likely to go down a very dangerous road that puts them very close to suicide. And so when we say that people, when they see our message, when they're interacting with our message here, right, and they might not be seeking our life, that's a really privileged thing that I can say. Because all of the places where I stand up for justice aren't places where I need help, right? Because of who I am, right? Engendered and the quote-unquote, like, right race for, like, the way our politics work here, right? It's just like, so to me, it's like, no, like, there are things that are seeking people's lives. There are things that are going after people. But I'm very privileged that that's not who it is for me. And I'm confessing right now that I can see the harm that's happening, right? And bad theology is killing people, right? And exclusion is killing people. And we need to be honest about that. But have you ever felt alone, right, in our fight here, or in our messaging here? Have you ever felt alone where we're at here? People leaving hate messages on your wall, tweeting mean things at you. I get letters all the time from people that think we're terrible people. They're always addressed to Rich McCullen, but that's okay, right? But there's people who are vile to their core, but they're masking it in this self-righteous indignation, right? I mean, the guy at Christ Church in New Zealand wrote a whole manifesto of why what he was doing was justified and how it was God's will for this to be happening, right? You can cover up a lot of evil that way. And there's a lot of evil people out there that are trying to do that to this place. Not what's happening in Christ Church. Please don't hear that, right? This place is safe. As safe as anything can be in America this moment. But there are people that don't like what we're doing. They don't love what we're doing. And they'll come after you. And that can be a really lonely feeling. And that's what Elijah was feeling, right? Elijah was afraid, and Elijah was lonely. And Elijah had begun to doubt God, right? Let's go back to that slide. It sounds very accusatory, right? I've been very passionate. Like, hey, God, I've been doing it. I've been doing the work, right? The Israelites, they've abandoned your covenant, right? Your laws you set up, God. They've torn down your altars. They've murdered your prophets. And I'm the only one left. Do you ever feel that way? You ever feel that way with God, where you're just going to have it out with God? You're like, God, why isn't this easier? Why am I not connected to more people? Why don't I feel better all the time doing the right thing? Doing the right thing can be really isolating and really lonely. So if you feel this way, don't feel guilty, right? Because Elijah, like we read this story a couple weeks ago, gets to like come down and like magic cloud thing and like hang out with Jesus on a mountainside, right? So you're in good company if you feel this way. So let's see how God responds. The Lord said, "Go out and stand at the mountain before the Lord. The Lord is passing by." Just then a very strong wind tore through the mountains and broke apart the stones before the Lord. But what? But the Lord wasn't in the wind. And after the wind, there was an earthquake. But the Lord wasn't in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, there was a fire. But the Lord wasn't in the fire. After the fire, there was a sound. I love the Contemporary English Bible for this, because this is first time I read this was amazing. After the fire, there was a sound, a thin quiet. A thin quiet. Is it different up there? No, it's good? All right. A thin quiet. Thin quiet. You ever been in that moment, that thin space where that quiet is deafening, it's crushing, and it's so present, right? And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his coat, right? He covered his face. And he went out and stood at the cave's entrance. And a voice came to him and said, "Why are you here, Elijah?" God's not in any of those loud moments, right? God's not in the winds or the earthquakes or the fires, but God shows up for Elijah in the thin and the quiet. And for me, it's that space where you feel the most alone, right? When there's the earthquake happening, when there's winds roaring, when there's fires blazing, there's stuff going on, there's noise distracting you. But where Elijah's sitting in this loneliness, God is showing up in this loneliness. And Elijah felt like he was alone, but the truth was that he wasn't alone, and God shows up where he feels the most alone. And beyond that loneliness and that feeling, Elijah had gotten into a place of self-pity and doubt that had blinded him, right? Elijah wasn't by himself. Elijah had God, but there was others out there that were faithful too. And later on in the story, like God goes in to tell about all the numbers of people that are still faithful out there and how Elijah's going to go meet Elisha. And you're like, all right, the casting director for the Bible should have kind of created some different names there because it gets confusing, especially if you did Bible drill or Awanas. You better not mix up Elijah or Elisha. Right? But this destructive conflict was a distraction from the truth, right? The stuff that was going on in Elijah's life, Elijah being in fear for his life, Elijah dealing with the conflict of those around him, that was a distraction from the truth that God still had people working towards good, that God still had a community on this earth, that God was still working towards justice, towards righteousness, towards creating a better world. Because all the bad stuff, all the hurting people, all the lives that were risked, all the voices crying out that this is not how it should be, that was a distraction for Elijah because God in the middle of that was there. Beyond all of the noise, beyond all the disasters, God was sitting there in that thin and quiet space saying, I am here. In our own noise, we can lose sight of God. We can isolate ourselves from community, right? We can seek to be individuals standing alone, right? We can be that old West cowboy. You just want to be guns at high noon, right? You can make yourself that person. But we are called and made to be in community. And that community is called to advocate for truth, to advocate for the light. But that community can't ever lose sight that God is with us, quietly working for good within us the whole time. So this Lent, as we struggle with the doubt of loneliness, of am I in this alone, how do we live out a better way together? Number one, take time away from those loud voices that are telling you you're alone, right? Spend some time away from that. You don't need to always hear all the bad voices out there, right? Jess and I had a conversation, yesterday. We have a friend, she posted this whole thing about why I'm glad my husband's superior to me, right? It was an article. She posted that. Jess was like, I'm going to read it just so I can be informed about what the other side's saying. And then she was like, she puts her phone down, she's like, actually, I'm not going to read this because it's just going to make me feel sad and angry, right? Sometimes just hit the pause button. You don't have to listen to all the chaos, right? You just take a deep breath and rest into the sanity of a bubble bath or whatever you need to do, right? Number 2, remember that God is not just with you in the big events, but also in those crushing and quiet times. God's with you not just when we're marching down the street. God's with you not just when it's election time, right? God's with you in all of those small, quiet spaces. God's with you when you're doing yard work. God's with you when you're wiping noses, right? God's with you in all of those quiet spaces. Number 3, remember you are called to live life in this community, right? Jesus created this beloved community. In a minute, we're going to celebrate that at this table. But you're called to live in this. That's why it sucks so much when you don't, right? You don't have to, it's just once a week. So even if you're that extreme introvert, once a week's okay, right? You're good for the month, right? But you're called to be in community. And number 4, remember that in your doubts and loneliness, God is whispering in your ear, I am with you always. Right? That's the promise Christ makes to us. I am with you always from now until the end of the age. God's never going to abandon you. God's never going to give up on you. Right? God will always be with you. And so in that quiet space, may you remember that God is always with you. May you be a part of your community. May you learn to remember that God is in the small things as well as the big things. And may you take time away from all the voices shouting and telling you that you're alone. May it be so.